Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Welcome to episode 84 of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Today, I am talking with my co-host, Holly, and we are wrapping up our conversation with Tembi Secrist. So if you missed part 1, you're going to want to make sure and go back and listen to episode 83, because this episode won't make a lot of sense if you have not heard that one yet. So if you're new around here, welcome. We're so glad you're here and part of our podcast community. I want to just encourage you to go back, check out episode 83, and then come back and make sure to listen to part 2 of episode 84. Now, if you listened last week, you know that Tembi's story is incredible. The way that she stepped out in faith and followed God's leading on a journey through 22 different countries over 14 months. And in this second part, you're going to be hearing the additional leadership lessons that she learned, some of the ways that God taught her the power of community through other people, and also some of the ways that she dealt with the fear that she faced in various situations as a single female traveling around Southeast Asia and Africa. So I'm excited for you to hear part 2 of our conversation with Tembi Secrist. So let's go ahead and jump in. So you've shared with us, I think, I'm not necessarily keeping track, but 3 or 4 lessons so far. So I think you have a couple more to share with us, right?
Yeah. You know, the other thing that really became evident is the idea that you are the product of you and your people. And I say product in a mathematical sense of multiplication, right? That it's you times the people that you know that gives a much greater impact than anything you could do on your own or your network can do on their own. So when you look at the people who God has put around you, when you look at the people that God has put in your path, working together, bringing in other expertise, identifying places where people can uniquely contribute to what God has given you, that it's not going to be accomplished just by you. It's not going to be just within your expertise, but it's you and the people that you know. Your impact will be multiplied far beyond what you could think or imagine. I was in Kenya and working out in this rural area. It was about an hour outside of the next biggest city. And I say city with, a caveat that it's a pretty small town, but it had an airport. So we were way, way out, in places there's dirt roads and shacks. And I was working with a local indigenous ministry there that had an orphanage and a school and helped to rehabilitate street boys. And a lot of their support came from local business people in that area in rural Kenya. And one of my good friends from Seattle was visiting in Europe and had a couple of days. And so I said, hey, why don't you come down and just visit? And he is a very successful CEO of a manufacturing firm. He employs, probably 350 people. They sell high-end products to luxury hotels around the world. Very successful business person. And so he said, sure, I've got some extra time. So he came down and we set up a meeting with some of these business people in this rural area for them to strategize about how they could better support some of these local ministries. And at first I was thinking, my gosh, what what kind of connection are they going to have? It's such a different scope of the type of business that they do. And these business people, they weren't doing roadside businesses. They had, more established businesses, but it's a very different scope and scale. So I wasn't sure how it was going to go. But he came in and just watching business minds connect, talking about innovation, talking about cash flow, talking about fundraising, talking about some ideas for building the future and, business networking groups and some of the things that he'd been involved in different countries he'd been to. There was such a spark there and such a value that he was able to provide that was far beyond anything I could have done because of his unique experience as a CEO in the business world. He loves business. He loves talking about it. He eats and he breathes it, right? This is his passion. And it was the same for these business people locally. That was their passion. And so they were able to spark together and build something that I wouldn't have been able to contribute. And the only reason I was able to help provide that value is because he was a friend of mine who happened to be in town. Again, when I'd gotten into the middle of Africa and my, my itinerary had just collapsed. I had 4 months left to go. And everything that I thought had been set up had just dissipated. Like, God, what am I going to do now? I had done some work in Uganda, and the regional director for that mission agency he got the plan that I had done for that office, and he was so impressed. He said, "Hey, I've got some friends in Malawi if you would like to go there next." And I said, "Yes, I would. That sounds great." Because of the work that I had done, because I had done it as unto the Lord to the best of my ability, that expertise gave him the confidence to refer me on. He had never met me personally, to his other friends who opened up their home, who took me in and set up these other ministry opportunities with their friends there. And they passed me on from that network into Mozambique. They had a network that kind of flowed onto there, and this opening network that went out before me that allowed me to continue this ministry path that was far beyond what I could have set up on my own. So I think part of it is also appreciating it's not just you, it's who you know and who else God wants to involve in what he is doing that is going to go through other people. And it's not necessarily going to be that straight path there, and allowing the humility to go out and to ask, hey, who else does this? Who else do you know? And I think for anyone in business or leadership, recognizing that sometimes you have to ask, you have to go out and say, hey, does anybody know about this? Does anybody know how I can get to this next step there? And that involves other people and gives them the ability to be involved in what God is doing in your ministry and in your path as well. And that's a huge trust to be able to take other people's trust personally, that if you mess this up, it also looks bad on them, right? That's a heavy trust to be able to say, okay, you have trusted your reputation on me. So, I have to do my very best as unto the Lord. And that expertise then becomes, that calling card to the next thing that you're going to do as well. So, understanding that when you start opening that up, when people become involved, that widens your ability of what you're going to do and how God is going to do that. And it may not be anything that you know currently.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest lessons I have learned in business in particular has been the relationships, the value of the relationships that I have,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
each of those relationships, like you said, it multiplies your ability to have an impact. But I also love the reminder that you just gave to be willing to ask. Like, be
Mm-hmm.
willing to tell people what you need or what type
Mm-hmm.
of referral you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people don't know, how are they actually going to be able to support you in
Yeah.
that?
Well, and something else I learned is don't be discouraged if people don't say yes right away. I was in Myanmar and working with some schools there that really are still in the British colonial setup, right? They are back in the 1950s and 60s, and it's very much based on rote memory, and it's tough for these kids. Only about 20% graduate high school. and they're trying to reform, but it's a long road to be able to get there. And so I'm not a teacher. I don't have that background and experience and expertise, but I know some teachers. And so, I sent out an email to someone I just thought would be absolutely perfect, using the network, using the referrals. And she said, it's not a good time. Okay. So I think of somebody else. So this person, she'd be great, send out this email. It's died. I don't think it's going to work. Okay, no problem. Think of a third person. Oh, and she responds back, this is exactly what I would love to do. I love training, and I want to set up my own business to do, teacher training and kind of start building my own expertise. I thought, great, this is exactly what I needed. So I introduced them, and then she disappears. And she ends up, she's going through some other things, and she later emails me, sorry, not going to work. I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm thinking, my goodness, here, I feel like I look like an idiot, right? I promised you 3 times. This is it for sure. We've got people who can do this. I know they do a great job. I know they love this. And 3 different times it just stops and it falls and it, disappears. I'm like, well, okay. But a couple of months later, I got in touch with a friend that I know distantly, right? She's a really good friend of a really good friend of mine. So I've only met her a few times. But I saw her post on Facebook, gosh, I just love training teachers. And so I reached out to her and I said, hey, this is a long shot, but would you ever consider going to Myanmar? There's a huge need of training teachers there. And, they would just love any sort of expertise. And she replies back, that sounds amazing. I would absolutely love that. I just started actually teaching in a university setting of teacher training. And, maybe we could bring some of these, teachers who are in their undergraduate with us and build more of a relationship and a connection. And I just thought, God, it's the perfect timing, the perfect person. It just took a few people until I got to the person who was better than what I would have expected. And she's excited about it. She's dedicated to it. So, even when the network doesn't work initially, sometimes it's just the timing and getting to the right person that God has in mind. And, for her, she would have never been able to find a person in Myanmar, but she loves the idea of, working out in rural areas that have a little bit of challenge and really being able to see a huge impact of what she's doing. So it was the perfect connection at the right time.
I love that reminder that God works in community, because I think sometimes we feel like, oh, well, God's told me to do this and it's me and I'm the one that has to accomplish it. I'm the one that needs to do this for God. When in fact, most of the time he calls us to work with others to allow him to actually do what he's going to do. And it's not really on us at all. So I love those examples that you've just given. But I wonder, as you're talking, I just think, in some of those situations, I would be so fearful. And I think, forget that God had given me a specific calling. And it looks like here, one of the things that you learned was specifically about fear. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about that.
Absolutely. So the sort of the 5th leadership principle that you really, I think, is also the first one is listens for God's voice, obey it, and then don't be afraid. Because if God calls you, he's not going to let you be put to shame. Right. And as I say that, I also am very cognizant of, missionaries who have given their life, right? That it doesn't mean that there's not going to be any danger, right? There are people who have been in terrible situations, and for whatever reason, terrible things have happened. So, it's not a, an instantaneous, nothing bad is going to happen to you.
Right.
So I do want to put that out there. But for my journey, I think it was something that you don't realize until you get to the end, what God has brought you through. So I ended up going from Kenya to South Africa over the course of 7 months, almost all by bus, which is not what I would have planned to do. It's not what I intended to do. And when I got to South Africa and told everyone how I ended up there, they all said to me, are you crazy? That's very dangerous. I can't believe you did that. And I said, well, gosh, now you tell me. I made it the end of my journey. But airfare in Africa is very expensive. just about anywhere you go, even if it's an hour or two flight, you're going to pay $500. You might have to go, a 5-hour flight north to go to a connecting city to get to the country next door. It's just not very easy to travel. And taking a bus is about $20 and I'm on a budget, right? And so, again, the thought of traveling by myself by public transportation is kind of a scary thought. And if I were to ask anybody, should I travel, anyone in Africa, anyone that I met there, should I travel all of Africa by myself by bus? They all probably would have said that's a terrible idea. But when I was there with each one and I said, well, how do I get to the next town? They all said, oh gosh, well, we do that all the time. You take this bus, you transfer at the city, ask someone there, they all know, and then you get off here. For each one, it was like, well, here's how you get to the next city. Oh yeah, we do that all the time. Here's the bus that you take. I'll drop you off, ask a person, transfer here, and you're where you want to go. And so when you think about the journey that took 7 months through, most of the east coast of Africa, as a whole, it's scary. But when you think about it, it really was just one city at a time. God just took me from one city to the next city. And that wasn't so scary to go from one city to the next city. And when you think about the journey of life where God is taking you, He doesn't wisely often tell us where we're going to end up. He just takes us from one city to the next city. And, you may be on a bus with chickens and children and somewhat uncomfortable, but you can manage it for 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, whatever else it is. But okay, 12 hours, I can do this. 7 months is too scary. I would have said no, right? But, 6 hours, I can do that. And so it's one step at a time, recognizing that God provides as you go. And again, looking at the number of people that God brought just when I needed it, that you wouldn't have known ahead of time, right? When I was in Nairobi, I had taken a train from the coast of Kenya, and then I was going to take a bus from Nairobi over to Uganda. And, that one in Nairobi, you can Google things and figure things out. And so there was a certain bus company that I was looking for. But on the train, I sat next to this man, and we got talking. And when it was time to get off, he said, well, I'm going to that area of town anyway. And I said, well, do you want to share a taxi? We can do that just fine. And so he said, sure. And so we got a taxi to where the buses were. And when we got there, I realized that this was a very sketchy part of town, right? It's an area known for high crime. And, I'm definitely standing out and I've got my luggage. I kind of look like a target. I'm clearly a tourist. Mm-hmm. But this local guy was with me and he said, actually this bus that you looked up, I don't think is the one that you want to take. You want to take this one over here. Okay. So we go over there and I said, well, I need to get cash to buy my bus ticket. And he says, you do not want cash here. Kenya was one of the first countries that developed mobile money where you can pay through your phone. Because in areas like that, the crime rate is so high, nobody wants to have cash. He said, you don't want cash here. I'm going to pay for your bus ticket on my phone because this is just too dangerous of a spot. And I said, okay. And so he paid for my bus ticket. He talked to the guards at the bus station there. And, we found a place to store my luggage. And, again, it wasn't something that I even realized that I needed help. But when I got there, I realized that God had provided somebody who was there just when I needed it to provide that help and to make sure that I was safe without even me knowing that that's what was going on. And again and again and again, I would show up in these countries for someone who was traveling all the time. I still wasn't always good at planning and research. I make a lot of assumptions where I just show up, like in Mozambique. They don't speak English. They speak Portuguese. I don't speak Portuguese. Without a plan really of how I was going to get clear across the country to where I was going to go, except for, well, there are buses that go there, right? I'll take a bus. And you can't Google these things. And then when I look back, I'm like, what was I thinking, right? I don't speak the language. I don't know how any of this works there. But I just, I'd taken a bus from Malawi over to Mozambique, showed up there, asked somebody to speak a little bit of Spanish from 20 years ago in Costa Rica, right? Portuguese is close enough there. And God provided somebody who just kind of walked me 5 miles from the border over to where the buses were. I had no idea it would take that long. But the taxis in Mozambique were bicycles, and that didn't seem very comfortable to carry all of my luggage on the back of a bicycle. So I just walked carrying 50 pounds of luggage. but there's this, young girl who just walked me exactly where I needed to go, got me on the bus, made sure the driver knew where I was supposed to get off. And I think she just, kind of wanted to see what would happen to this weird white girl who just shows up and carries her own luggage for 5 miles in the heat of the day. But again and again and again, when I realized that God had put people just at the right spot, just at the right time, that there was no reason for me to be afraid. When you think about it too far ahead and you don't know how it's going to work, you don't know what's going to happen, it's easy to get fearful. But when you just take that step at a time and recognize that God is going before you, and just at the right time, He will provide the right people, then you go and say, okay, God, do not fear. You are with me, and you're going to take care of me as I go. Something else along those same lines. I was up in northern Uganda, and I met another gal there who was working for 6 months on a contract. She was up there by herself. And we got to talking of what it's like to travel as a solo female, in countries that it's not as common, right? And you stand out, and the logistics aren't always as easy to figure out. She said, things are just scary when you haven't done them before. Once you've done them before, they're no longer scary. She was talking about the first time she went into an airport and trying to figure out the reader board, right? Something that, once you've flown, it just seems like second nature. She said, I was so confused, and somebody had to come up and say, are you okay? And show me how to find the gate and what I was looking for, because I'd never done it before. And sometimes we forget that once you've done it, it's no longer scary. And it's just the fear of the unknown that makes it seem so much bigger and so much scarier than it is. But once you step out and once you do it, you realize, that wasn't so bad. And you just kind of keep doing that again and again. And when you finish up, you look back, you're like, wow, that was kind of cool. And I made it. And, I think that, well, just, real quick, as part of that, one of the things that also really stands out when it comes to the scary, when it comes to the unknown, I don't want to give the impression that everything was just perfect. Right. And, there were times when, I was crying and I'm like, God, I don't know what I'm going to do next. And, I don't know how this is going to work out. And, when I'm camping out on this small island in Mozambique, it took 2 different interpreters to speak to the local people there, from English to Portuguese, from Portuguese to the local language. 7,000 people, no electricity. They had a well, for water there, pit latrines, in your bucket showering outside on dirt there. And I couldn't figure out where their bathrooms were for the first, 12 hours. And, it was just very, very uncomfortable, right?
That's a scary feeling. Not knowing where the bathroom is.
Right. And, I'm just thinking, I'm kind of over this. It's exciting at first to do things different, but it's just exhausting, and I'm tired, and I don't know what's going on, and I can't talk to anyone. But as I was going through my time there and talking with the people, and, realizing the way of living there that's so different, where they're still having to cook outside over open fires. Just getting a cup of coffee in the morning is an effort. You have to build a fire. You have to boil the water. I brought my own instant coffee because that's one thing that makes me a better Christian, is coffee in the morning. Know
yes.
yourself, right?
Yes, I hear you.
And this area where hygiene is very different, because I was a guest. They always made sure that I had silverware. And this one day, and the silverware was all being used, and they had miscounted, and so they went and they said, hey, we need your spoon. And so they grabbed the spoon that somebody had already been using and dipped it in some water and handed it to me. And I thought, gosh, after this, my immune system is going to be so amazing. I will probably never die. Right? So a lot of new situations. But when I look back, it's honestly those stories that are less comfortable, that are a little bit scarier, that are different, that were the situations where I was frankly somewhat miserable, that are the best memories. They're the ones that I look back and like, oh my gosh, you got to listen to this one. Nobody wants to hear the story of when you got your hotel room and things were fine, right? Like, those are boring stories. They want to hear about when you're out there wondering if the duck poop is going to get into your food, right? And, using the mango leaves as a spoon there. Those are the interesting stories. And so when you look back, you realize that the most uncomfortable situations really are some of the best memories. And so when you're in those situations, when you're in that discomfort, when you're trusting God, when you're saying, why am I here? Kind of being able to separate yourself out and having a bit of that sense of humor and saying, you know what? This is going to be the story that I'm going to tell that people are going to want to listen to. And then I'm going to look back and honestly be glad that I went through it and be glad that I'm on the other side of it. But it makes for a great story.
Oh, goodness. That's so amazing. I just love that reminder because thinking back even to our time in Costa Rica, I always go back to the time that the cow almost attacked me and I thought I was going to die. That is a good story.
Right.
But the story of, oh, yeah, we sat down every night with my Costa Rican family and ate dinner.
Right.
That's not really that exciting. So,
right.
So true. So true. But sometimes, like you said, in the moment, it doesn't feel that comfortable and you're not even sure what's going to happen or how you're going to make it out alive. So I am curious. You've shared with us so many good principles and I am excited to share this with our audience, but I'm curious. I want to go back for a minute to when you decided to go on this trip. What did your family and friends say? Because this was not like a normal thing to do. So did you have any pushback or was there fear from family involved in any of this in you deciding as a single female to go around the world?
I feel very, very fortunate that my family is incredibly supportive. Now, I know my dad would have absolutely preferred that I was traveling with a team, that I was with, a big organization. Even as old as I am, you're always your parents' little girl, right? And before I left, the morning that he was taking me to the airport, he was praying over me, and there were tears in his eyes there, and I know he was interceding for me every single day. But by and large, I think people were excited for what it could be. And, I think they always kind of suspected that at some point I would kind of bust out and do something crazy. So I feel very blessed that I had a lot of support. When I first posted this on Facebook, I got, probably 200 comments about, this is amazing, go do it. This will be the adventure of a lifetime. And for my birthday, a couple of my friends took all of those Facebook comments and put it into a little booklet that I could take with me on my adventure when you're not, connected to the internet and kind of isolated. And they said, if you need encouragement or just that support, knowing that, your community is with you and your friends support you and people are praying for you, here's a booklet just to remind you to go through that and say, okay, this is okay. And people are behind me there. But I think it is a big thing that there always will be people who I don't think intend to discourage you, but they're honestly trying to make sure that you've thought through everything and they're concerned, and people who are naturally a little bit more cautious. And it's always wise to listen. And those aren't bad things, right? God, again, created your community with different gifts, with different ways of looking at things. So being able to balance what is good caution, what is good advice that you should take into consideration, and what is just going to distract you from what God has called you to, and being able to take those, recognize the love behind it, but not get discouraged if you know that is what God has called you to do. And sometimes that can be a balance, right? And just trusting that when you know that God has spoken, while still being wise and still trying to go forward, with logic and the wisdom that God has given you. But sometimes you just have to leap in and do it, even if it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. I love that. Trying to hold that balance between the wisdom from people, but also if God has said, go do this thing, sometimes that has to win out.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I think also recognizing that only you understand all the nuances of your situation, right? So I would text updates. I had this, inner circle of friends and family members that, would pray for me and just to let them know, where I was at all times, just in case something happened. At one point I said, okay, I'm going to need a lot of prayer because this next transition is going to be 3 modes of transportation. I have to take a motorcycle for 2 hours to the border of Rwanda. Then I have to take one minibus to another town and then another minibus. And this is, kind of the first time I'd taken some of these minibuses in between, not just kind of going between capital city to capital city. one of my friends responded back and she says, Tembi, I think you're taking too many risks. I think this isn't wise. You really need to be more cautious. And her heart was right. Her heart was good. And I appreciated that. But when you're in the situation, you realize, well, I don't have a lot of other options, right? So there's no other way to get there. So sometimes I would only update them when I got to a city safely, which probably wasn't the wisest thing for me to do. But I'm like, well, I don't want them to worry, so I'll just tell them when I make it. If I hadn't have made it, I don't know what would have happened there. So I wouldn't recommend that to other people. But I think just recognizing that when you're in the middle of the situation, you are aware of things and options and just the nuances that not everyone else will be aware of. So when they're offering their well-meaning advice, you have to take that with a grain of salt, kind of putting it in with everything else that is going on, and understanding how much weight to give that. And again, the most important thing is if God has called you, you have to go.
Yeah. Okay, so that leads me to my next question, which is maybe a little bit trickier to answer for you. But, you're in a different situation than, say, myself and Holly, and a lot of our audience are potentially married and or have kids. And so you were in a situation where it was just you making this decision for yourself. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what about the woman who is sensing God is calling her to do something big? But perhaps there's other factors in her life, like being married or having kids, that would potentially be, I don't want to say barriers because that sounds like it's a bad thing, but, that just add in that extra complexity. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any ideas on how she might handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I very much believe that family is God's call as well. And so God is not going to call you with a call that is immediate and unbreakable if that is going to disrupt your marriage, your children, because that is also a call of God and that's important. But if God has put something on your heart, being able to articulate it, being able to communicate that, and also trusting that God can provide for your family, right? If you get that agreement, if you get that, okay, we support you, we're doing this together, to not let the fear of what if and should I and all these other things hold you back. Because if God can provide for a single woman protecting her, by bus through Africa, God can also provide for taking care of your family. And if you need additional childcare or extending the hours in the day so that you can have time with your kids as well as your business, He's a big God. So I think often it's easy to find excuses because things are scary. And I don't want to downplay it, right? Things are scary. And again, at the end of this journey, I'm still in the, okay, God, what you're calling me to next, I'm still praying and getting clarity, but it's big and it's scary. But trusting that if God has really called you to that He's going to provide for you in that way, in the way that will open up the path in your specific situation with your specific needs. And I think also being creative of what doing something big looks like, right? It doesn't have to mean going overseas. One thing that God has really put on my heart after having done this experience is the need for more professional engagement in missions and international nonprofits. This idea of taking the skill set that you have in the workplace, in your churches, and being able to build capacity and offer training and help raise the standard of how these nonprofits internationally are able to engage in their community from your expertise and from your knowledge set. And sometimes you don't even have to leave your home to do that, right? You can have, a Skype or a Zoom or, a virtual connection, say, hey, listen, here's some accounting principles that would help your bookkeeper. Just being able to give an hour or two. These are some things that I've learned early childhood development. Here's some research that's just come out that we found to be very effective that can provide training for people who are working with kids, don't have any resources there. So sometimes you can find creative ways to fulfill that call in a way that makes sense for your situation in life.
Yeah, so helpful.
I love that. I think that's just so valuable for our listeners and really good for them to hear from you. So you kind of alluded to it in your answer that you just gave to Esther, but I'm wondering what is next for you?
Yeah, well, it's something that I'm honestly still in a lot of prayer and kind of tossing around a couple of different ideas. I feel like I need to do a lot more writing about this experience, about this journey. I've gotten up on my blog to about 6 months in, so I'm way behind for where it needs to be, and just being able to capture some of those journey adventures that went on, as well as the miracles and the people that I met. So that will be part of it, is doing some more writing around that. But I'm really praying about this idea again of helping make connections with people in their professional expertise and what's needed overseas. So this idea of volunteer your career. I think especially in the church, we've gotten stuck in this idea of missions, that you show up, you often do unskilled labor, and there's good things that come out of that, right? Being exposed to what life is like in people, but it's often more for you going on the trip, seeing what God is doing, than a lasting impact that helps the organization get to a different level. And so trying to brainstorm with churches, and even with people out in the corporate world, what is a higher value way to engage in international volunteering, in missions trips, where you find a platform to really help match some of your professional skills with what is needed. So I think the medical community has done this well, right? With,
Mhm.
Doctors Without Borders and sort of medical missions. But at the same time, you need social media experts without borders. You need accountants without borders, right? You need, psychologists who can help
Mm.
these kids and these families who have gone through trauma, which often is what starts the family disintegration, which means,
Mm.
they're in desperate poverty, which, impacts their kids. And there's this cycle that has never been healed of trauma, and you add in some of these massive war and famine and some of these other things that go in there, and they don't often have resources and expertise to help break some of these cycles. And so then you end up with, orphans and all these other things, where when you get to the root of the problem, you can keep the families together. And that's the strongest
Mm.
solution for a lot of these communities. So I'm praying about what that looks like, if that's an NGO, if that's kind of working with something, that already exists there, if that's, just kind of talking about it and letting, different organizations figure out how that applies. But it's something that's kind of rattled around in my brain actually for a couple of years. 3 years ago, I volunteered with refugees in Greece at one of the largest refugee camps there. And it was an amazing experience. But for me, even finding the opportunity to volunteer there was really hard. It was through, somebody that I knew that knew of an organization that took volunteers. It's tough to get in there. And once I got there, I volunteered as a frontline volunteer, which was fine. That's what I volunteered to do. But at that time, I had already been leading this global team and had been developing expertise in structures and best practices and benchmarking. And I looked at this refugee camp, and it was just chaos because it was run by all these volunteers that turned over, every few weeks or months. And I thought, gosh, I would be so much better utilized if I could get behind the scenes and help them organize how they bring in people, how they train them, how they onboard them, because that's my expertise, rather than, kind of at the front line handing out food. And so this idea of how do we really dig in and help people find the best match for what they do, what they're passionate about, with where these deepest needs are, would be a great NGO, a great platform that, as far as I know, doesn't exist well currently. So I'm praying about that. If you or any of your listeners have ideas or want to help me with that, please let me know.
That's awesome. I love that. And we will be praying for sure. And we never know. We never know who's listening to this podcast that might be able to connect you. So, Tembi, I just am so grateful for everything you've shared today. And what we always like to wrap up our conversations with is the idea that leaders are learners. And
Mm,
so we really believe that, we should just be ongoing learning in order to continue to develop as leaders. So, is there anything that you have been personally learning, whether it's a book you're reading or a podcast you're
mhm.
listening to, or just a lesson God is teaching you that you would want to share with our listeners today?
Yeah, I am a huge reader. I love to read and kind of look at what's going on in the corporate world and how we can apply that in ministry, and also what's going on in ministry and how that can be applied in the corporate world there. But a couple of things that God has really just been solidifying in me. One of them is, if you don't stretch, you won't grow, right? Unless you put yourself out there in the discomfort, you're never going to grow as a leader. You're never going to grow in your personal walk. It has to be uncomfortable. If it's comfortable, it's not stretching. So putting yourself out there where it's scary, where it's uncomfortable, that's where the growth happens. That's where you become the next level of who you're meant to be. But along with that, to enjoy the adventure, right? In the middle of it, to look for things that are fun, that are funny, looking at what God is doing at the time there. There's a lot of joy that comes in sometimes the scary things and sometimes the things that you don't expect, and embracing even those small pleasures. Coffee, God blessed me with coffee every single day of my journey. And that honestly it was a little bit of a concern, right? Like, what am I going to do about my coffee? Every single day I had coffee, in all these different situations. And so those small things where you can just say, this is great. And every morning when I had my coffee, it was just that, is that small reminder of, gosh, Jesus loves me. And, along the line of the learners there, I would encourage people to look at management books. One that I referenced often as I was talking with some of these different groups was The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It's not a new book, but there's a lot of great principles that I learned from there. It was one of the most recent books that I had read on management before I left. So it was fresh and, a lot of applications in that. So there's some great resources out there. And I think exposing yourself to as many different thoughts and approaches, whether it's from the tech world, whether it's from psychology, whether it's from management, they all kind of intertwine together. And at the end of the day, it's just humans everywhere. And, humans are humans, and we all want to be respected and loved and accepted in every place that we are. And so as a leader, if you can help provide that safety for people, you can get a lot out of them and be much more effective in the mission that you've been called to do.
So good. I just love everything that you've been saying. I feel like we could talk for a couple more hours, but we do need to wrap up. So I would love it if you would tell our audience the best way to connect with you so that they can follow your journey as you move forward.
Sure. My blog is a great place to start. It's the September edition.blog. And you're also welcome to shoot me an email. I think Esther might be able to post that on the podcast notes there, but would certainly love to hear from anyone, answer any questions. If somebody is thinking about, doing a crazy round the world trip, I would love to talk with you and just let you know that it's a great idea and you should totally do it.
And are you still located in the Seattle area right now?
Yes.
Tembi?
Yes,
Okay.
I am.
Okay. So if somebody is maybe looking for a speaker for, I think I read on your blog that you are open to speaking at events about this trip and things like that. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. I've been doing quite a bit of speaking and I love it every time. There are so many more stories. And just as a teaser, there's, all the stories that you can't share publicly, right? Like, finding the bathroom and the latrine and the things that I'll just tell you when we're in person. So invite me to be a speaker and you'll get the rest of the story.
That's a really good teaser for getting a speaking gig. I got to remember that one. Well, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. And I will definitely put all the links to connect with you in the show notes. And we appreciate you sharing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk with you and just to be able to share some of these experiences as well.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. We look forward to chatting with you next week. And don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.